Well, thanks very, very much. So I'm going to talk today about a grand gender convergence and what I call its last chapter. And I'm not looking at my phone, I'm just timing this thing. So, and if I say anything that you have a question about, I'm quite willing to take questions during the presentation, but I will end with enough time for questions. So, to my mind, and I hope to yours as well, the converging economic roles of men and women are among the grandest advances of the last century. And I think of, this is not, okay. So I think of each part of this grand set of advances as a figurative chapter in a history of gender roles. And if, in fact, if each one is a figurative chapter in a metaphorical book, I'm not saying the book has been written or that I'm going to write the book, the question then comes to mind, if it is a book, it must have a last chapter, and how must the last chapter be written, and can it be written? And so this, as was just noted, I like detective stories. And so this is a detective story. And in my work on this, I discovered something, and I discovered that the last chapter can be written, but how it must be written may come as a surprise to you, because it came as a bit of a surprise to me. And it's not going to be written with government intervention, and we can talk about that, and it's not going to be written by giving women greater skills at bargaining or making them better at math, because in fact they are extremely good at math, so that's not going to work. Okay, what it must involve is changes in how jobs are structured and how jobs are remunerated to enhance what I call, what we call temporal flexibility, the ability to allocate time over time. And it must involve an actual decrease in the cost to firms of substituting the hours of one worker for another. And let me make that very clear. That is not something that's going to be legislated. That's something that has to happen, either organically in terms of technological changes. It's not something that's easily legislated. So the gender gap in pay per unit time would just about vanish if there was what I call linearity in various ways. So one way of thinking about linearity is that a worker who works 70 hours a week gets per unit time the same as what each worker who worked 35 hours a week would get. That would be linearity. So I'm going to be looking today at occupations in the technology, science, and health sectors and contrast them with those in the corporate, financial, and legal sectors. These are going to be mainly college graduates, so I'm going to be mainly looking at the upper part of the education and income distribution. So there's been a great narrowing in the human capital attributes of men and women for quite some time in this country and many other countries more recently. And this is true in terms of labor force participation, and we can see that here. In education and college majors and professional schools in lots of different ways. The human capital attributes have really come together. And they've come together so much that those of us who produce things called residual gender earnings gaps have noticed that in fact in most data sets, we sort of squeezed out as much as we can squeeze out in terms of the fact that the human capital attributes are so similar. And so therefore these residual gaps done with the usual data sets, not some of the data sets that I'm going to tell you about at the end of my talk, the residual gaps are about equal to the raw differences now. We're not getting any mileage in saying, oh, I'm going to. It used to be that you can say, well, you know, men and women, they have different levels of college education. They took different courses, different majors, different professional schools. I'll sort of make them the same econometrically. That's just not going to do anything anymore. So the question is, what must be in the last chapter for it to be the last? And so Holmes is my favorite detective, and it's not that Holmes that some of you know from television. That's not the real Holmes. That's some fictitious character. This is the real Holmes. The real Holmes is the one that you read in these things called books. And Holmes is fond of talking about the fact that you need to have data, and that, you know, he likes theorizing, but you can only theorize once you have some data. And so I don't want to insensibly twist the facts to suit the theories instead of the theories to suit the facts. So what I'm going to do is going to give you some evidence and then step back from it and say what type of theory will help me, and then run with that theory. Okay, so the first piece of evidence, so two pieces of evidence I'm going to give you. The first piece of evidence considers pay gaps among, and this is college graduates, in cohorts from 1958 to 1978. And each point here is a coefficient on the interaction of female times the age group in a large regression, which controls for all the stuff at the bottom, controls for hours and weeks and education above college graduate. The sample is for college graduate men and women, white, non-military, 25 to 69 years old. And so on the horizontal axis is age, on the vertical axis is the log of the ratio of female to male annual earnings, and I converted it into the female to male ratio so that you can remember that minus 0.5 is 0.61, etc. Okay, so this is from 7 cross sections from 1970 to 2010. And these are created into these synthetic cohorts. And the findings are, first of all, that there's decreasing pay gaps across cohorts, meaning that that cohort born in 1978, its line is above the cohort born in 1973, whose line is above the cohort born in 1968, and so on. So that's the first thing. But more importantly than that, it's every cohort begins looking more similar, men and women in that cohort, in terms of their annual earnings, corrected for all this stuff that you can correct for in the ACS and the census. But there are greatly increasing gaps within cohorts, okay? Greatly increasing. And the gaps, if we looked at some of the older cohorts, you'd see even larger gaps, and then you'd see something increasing. That thing that's increasing we're not going to talk about today, but it's interesting to hypothesize and to investigate why. So that's the first piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence, the second set of clues that I'm going to provide then to step back and say what type of theory could I devise to help us. The second set of clues comes from estimating gender earnings gaps by occupation. And here I'm going to be using the approximately 470 detailed, not super detailed in some cases, occupations in the census and the ACS. Mainly the ACS I'm going to be using, the American Community Survey. But before I do this, I have to note that occupations really do matter. We often talk about occupational segregation by sex, and we talk about it as if we made occupations the same for men and women, we would eliminate a lot of the gap. And the point is, unfortunately, that's just not the case. At the 3-digit level, the majority of the gap is due to the gap within occupations and not across. In fact, for all workers, far more is due to within occupations, about 85% is. For college graduates, somewhat less, 65% is. So one can do this various ways. One can use the usual tried and true method of saying, I'm going to hold the gap constant within the occupations and make men and women the same in terms of the fraction in these occupations. That's one way of doing it. You get numbers that don't look like occupations are going to explain a lot. Within occupations explain a tremendous amount. So occupations are going to matter a lot, and you're going to see in a moment that they do. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this empty graph and I'm going to populate it with numbers. Each dot is going to be an occupation. So once again, on the horizontal axis, I have the log of male wage and business income, so that, just to remember, the log of 60,000 is equal to 11. So I drew a line at 11 because I'm going to be focusing today on people with annual incomes above 60,000, okay? And the highest income there, which is around 12, is equal to 160,000. Now on the vertical axis, once again, is the coefficient on female times occupation, which is essentially the gender gap for that occupation. And once again, just to map it into the logs, I've also given the ratios. Okay. So let's populate it. So this is going to come from a massive regression in which I have millions of observations from the ACS. I know everyone's occupation. I know everyone's gender. I put an age and a quartic. I have all sorts of other variables that you can add to this. And this is what you get out, and it looks like a mess, okay? It's sort of interesting, though, if you look at the slope of that line, that there is almost no relationship. If anything, it goes in the opposite direction from what one might have thought, that the high income increasing, going across the income scale for the occupations, the wage gap doesn't necessarily decrease, as one might have thought. It's about flat if you look at all these occupations, okay? But if you only look at the occupations above 11 and you categorize them, or if you categorize all of them, things are going to look a lot more interesting. So let's look at only the ones above 11. Once again, it's the same axes that I had before. And I've classified the occupations in the following groups. So those red squares are the business and the corporate sector. And you can see that they are the ones with the highest gender gaps, okay? And the triangles, the green ones, are the tech sector, and the lighter colored triangles are science. Those are the ones with the smallest gender gap. The other, most important other, is the one that's the furthest out in terms of the highest income. That's law. There's a whole bunch of others in the lower income group. And the blue symbols are in the health sector. Okay, and I'm going to tell you what these are in a moment. Okay, so it's pretty clear that the tech occupations have the lowest gaps. These are occupations in which women are, you know, somewhere between 5% and 20%. They're a very low fraction, but the gender gaps are quite small. Except for one, which is the outlier, and that's that dude down there who flies your planes. And there are some very good reasons why the gender gap for airline pilots is much higher, and why, in fact, airline pilots probably don't belong in this tech group. Okay, the tech occupations include engineers, information systems, programmers, and these have the lowest gender gaps, as you can see. So you might have wondered what all these others are, and this is a good smattering of what they are. You can see, for example, that the health occupations are sort of all over the map. The ones with the largest gaps, podiatrists and dentists, and I bet you didn't realize just how much podiatrists made. They're high income. Have more respect for your podiatrist and your dentist. So there's ownership. Women, for various reasons that I will get into, eschew ownership. Ownership involves rents from being the residual claimant. So women in those occupations generally don't own, the men own. And the one that's very interesting that I'm going to get to at the end of my talk is pharmacy. And you can see that has a very small gender gap, and it has very low rates at this point of ownership. And I'll get into that in good time. Okay. So another piece of evidence, therefore, in these clues that I'm providing, another piece of evidence is the large difference in the residual gender gap across occupations. And the question is, why is there such a big difference? And one of the hints about this comes from freeing up the coefficient on hours by occupation. When I was doing this regression here, getting these coefficients, I simply put in log of hours. This is for full-time, full-year workers, so they're all working 35 hours or more per week, but they're working many different hours. So what I'm going to do now is give you the results of freeing up the coefficient on hours. And the way in which I'm going to do it is I'm going to interact log of hours with each of the occupations, the same way I interacted it with gender. And what this means is that I can get a sense, a much better sense of which occupations are those occupations which have this nonlinearity. For which occupations is it the case that if you work twice as many hours, you get more than twice as much per hour, okay? And so I did that, and this is what I get. And so I produced something that we can call an elasticity of annual earnings with respect to weekly hours. And I graphed that on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, I have the coefficient on female for each of the occupations. Okay, and so once again, you can see precisely what I was talking about before, which is that the red squares, which are the business and the finance occupations, are the ones with the highest elasticities. The estimate of this elasticity is downward biased for various reasons. So these are, it's pretty amazing that that many of them are over 1. Some of them are slightly below 1, probably with standard errors that mean that we can't really differentiate it. There are a couple of outliers that are interesting. Financial examiners is a very interesting outlier because financial examiners are almost all, if not all, in the public sector. Okay, so their pay is going to be different from the others in the corporate sector, and actuaries break out from the tech group. That they're in the tech group because they're statisticians, but they're actually in the corporate sector. So this is pretty good evidence that something is going on in terms of hours. So let me summarize. So the summary number 1 is that earnings gaps rise with age. We saw that with the first information, possibly to some point. The second piece of information, a clue, is that earnings gaps really differ a lot by occupation, an enormous amount. Even holding, this is not because there are educational differences. This is not because women in some of them are very young, and in others the guys are much, much older. That's not what's going on. And the third one is that hours matter differently by occupation and sector. So I've provided the clues, and we can now explore some theory, very simple theory. And so I want to show you a framework, very, very simple framework, that explores what happens when employees cannot costlessly hand off clients. You've got a client, you get a call at 10 o'clock, your kid fell in the schoolyard, you have to leave. I don't care if you're a man or a woman, you're a parent, and someone's going to have to go and take care of that kid. And you're sitting with a client, and you can't dismiss the client. You have to hand the client off to someone. What does that client think when you say, Janet is going to take care of the client? Okay. Do they say, oh, she's just as good as Claudia, that's just fine? Or do they say, I'm not going to pay this bill, because I wanted you to do my taxes today. I wanted you to do my divorce, my will. I wanted you to diagnose my tumor. In what sense can you easily hand off clients? Okay. What I'm going to show you is sort of the foundations of compensating differentials. So I want to consider something very simple. So let's think about an individual who has a law degree and enters some job. And the job here is job 1, and the horizontal axis is number of hours. Okay? Number of hours may not be exactly what we want. It may be which hours the person works. But right now, let's just think of it as number of hours. And the person earns K1 per unit time. That's just part of the productivity. But if the person works under lambda 1 star hours, the productivity falls a lot. And then that delta is the penalty to this handing off, the penalty to working fewer hours. So if this were the only job, and let's say that this is a lawyer working in a large law firm, okay? If this were the only job, that would be the stark choice that the lawyer has. But there are other things that you could do with a law degree, okay? You can work in a smaller law firm. In the smaller law firm, you get less per hour. But in addition, if you work fewer hours than here lambda 2 star, your penalty is less. Well, there's yet other things you can do with a law degree, other havoc that you can wreak on society. So you can be a corporate counsel. You could be corporate counsel at Princeton University, and here you have a very linear productivity. So under these conditions, the individual then is faced with these choices. You put them together, and there is a nonlinear relationship between time worked and the hourly wage. Okay. So there are implications of this, and the implications are the following. So you can ask, well, what is it about these occupations that would lead to more nonlinearity? Well, you could see before that it has to do with this penalty, how large the penalty is, and whether there are occupations that you can enter with that degree for which there isn't a penalty and for which the wage is just as high. So nonlinearity comes about in large part because employees need to be around. There is face time, which is something that I have no concept about. Okay? Many of my students go for the summer and they work at Goldin, and they come back and I ask them, well, what did you do? And they say, well, I was there like at 7 in the morning. And I say, why? And they said, FaceTime, and they're like doing nothing. And they get paid a lot. Well, FaceTime is good for other things, I suppose, but I don't get it. So nonlinearity comes back because you have to have contact with others. Decision-making frequency is very high. There are interpersonal relations. It's therefore costly to hand off clients. The clients are very dependent. There's little standardization, and therefore it's costly to hand off clients. There are interdependent teams. You have to get the team together, like in consulting. And so the more nonlinear, the lower the relative earnings of women with kids, the fewer will achieve career and family. Linearity, on the other hand, comes about because there are better substitutes for individuals who work there, or very good substitutes. There are independent teams. So I was pleased to get a note from Bank of America a couple of years ago that told me that my personal banker whose name I have forgotten, let's call him Jason, that my personal banker had essentially been cloned. Now I had 10 personal bankers, and I should be really happy about this, that it was a team of personal bankers, all of whom were equally good to Jason. I had a minor eye procedure done by a well-known ophthalmologist in Boston who sent me a note, and I know it was an extremely personal note, a couple of weeks after the procedure, and it said, "Congratulations." It had my name. And then it said, "Congratulations, you've been such a good patient that you needn't see me ever again. And I have a team of 20 professionals who will take care of every one of your needs." Okay, and they're all better than I am together as a team. So that's the notion of these independent teams that are good substitutes for each other. Role of scale, you'll see that in pharmacy. Use of information systems to hand off clients, in particular in certain healthcare. Pharmacists in particular have an extremely good way of handing off clients, okay, and we'll talk about that later. So the more linear, the higher the relative earnings of women, and the more will remain in the labor force and achieve career and family, because they're not taking as big a hit as they would if they scaled down. Okay, so given this theory, what occupational characteristics should be related to these residual gender gaps? And I'm going to provide a little bit of general evidence and then just a smattering of specific evidence having to do with vignettes of particular occupations. First, the general. The general comes from something called ONET. For those of you, some of you know ONET and have used it. There used to be something called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles. Think of ONET as the Dictionary of Occupational Titles on steroids. Okay? Okay. There are thousands of occupational characteristics. And many of these occupational characteristics will have little to do with the problem at hand. They would have something to do with whether strength is required, whether your thumb is important in what you do, or some other fingers. And but there are some characteristics that are of real relevance to this framework that I've just developed. And there are 5 of them here. One has to do with time pressure. I listed the questions that are asked in ONET that these occupations are scaled concerning contact with others. For example, how much does this job require the worker to be in contact? So this is the FaceTime aspect, the interpersonal relations. Establishing and maintaining interpersonal relationships is one. Freedom to make decisions is one. Structured versus unstructured work is another. And what I did is I took these, I normalized each characteristic to have 0 mean and standard deviation 1. And let me note that because this is the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, ONET, every one of the occupations is listed. In fact, it's more, so there are 469 separate occupations in the ACS. In ONET, each occupation, many of them will have several sub-occupations because it might be that occupation in a particular industry, okay? So we had to re-aggregate them. And so we normalized them, and then we looked at them with regard to the occupations that we've been dealing with. And that I'm dealing with about somewhere between 95 to 100 occupations. And so remember, there were the science and technology occupations, there were the business ones, there were the health ones, and then there was the law, and then there were a bunch of others, okay, that were very difficult to categorize. So it's pretty clear in aggregating this that the science and technology occupations have low scores. Low scores mean that they are that they would be more linear occupations, and the high scores mean that they would be more nonlinear. In other words, the high scores would mean a lot of time pressure, a lot of contact with others, a lot of interpersonal relations. So it's pretty clear that there's something going on, that the business occupations versus the technology and science ones, the difference is about 3/4 to 1 standard deviation. The law looks more like the business. The health is sort of all over the place, as it sort of should be. Okay, so that's one sort of set of examples here in terms of how to apply this theory. And it shouldn't be surprising, therefore, that there is an association between the average of the 5 ONET scores, which is on the horizontal axis, and the gender pay gap for college graduates. So that shouldn't be surprising at all, given that I just said that the ones with the highest gaps have the highest scores. Okay. Let me give you let me end with 3 pieces of more specific evidence. The first one comes from the world of business, and the second one comes from lawyers. Okay. For each of these, I'm fortunate to have detailed longitudinal evidence that gives us some handle for why the gaps are so large. For the first one, for business, this comes from a study that I've done with Marion Bertrand and Larry Katz, which is of University of Chicago Graduate School of Business, MBAs, who got their MBAs from 1990 to 2006. And we gave them a survey. We have the administrative data from this thing that's now called the Booth School. Okay, when we started this, it was the Graduate School of Business, and then it changed. And so this is in a paper, and so I'm not going to go through very much of it. But what we see in it is, on the horizontal axis is years since receiving an MBA. So male and female MBAs on the vertical axis, once again, it's the gender gap in log annual earnings. So correcting for, we call it MBA performance, and that's mainly, did you take a lot of finance courses and then take more finance courses at Booth than women do? Correcting for that, they come out and they earn approximately the same amount. It's about 5 log points difference. But as time goes on, their earnings spread apart quite a lot, so that by year about 13 or so, they're about 45 log points difference, which is a very large number. So that would be a ratio of about 65 cents on the dollar. Okay. So the question is, how can we explain this difference? And what we find is that 2 factors are very good at explaining the difference. One is, the smaller one is the amount of time that women or men, and it's either, take off from work, okay? Gaps in their employment. And the other one is hours of work, okay? Now, hours of work for these MBAs is extremely high. So there's no occupation that we have in which weekly hours, the mean of weekly hours is under 45 hours a week. So these are not part-time jobs. If anything, the corporate and the financial sector are very inflexible, and that's one of the reasons that women don't do very well in or men who would like flexibility in the corporate and financial sector. So the bottom line here is that that hours and time and place matter a tremendous amount in the corporate and financial sector. I have better data on lots of different things for the law project, and the reason is that the MBA study we did asking retrospective questions. You don't do as well. For this law data that I have, this is the University of Michigan Law School Alumni Research Data Set. I don't know if anyone here went to the University of Michigan. I doubt that anyone here has a law degree from the University of Michigan, but it's always possible. But they are the most loyal alums, okay? So they were, so whenever I present this, I always thank anyone in the room who was a University of Michigan Law School graduate. They were given surveys to fill out every, at various anniversaries, 5th, 10th, 15th, 25th, etc. And they were so good at filling them out that someone at Michigan at some point realized that they could link them. So they never did it as a longitudinal survey, but they had so much that they linked people. And so that's what I'm using here, although I'm not using all of the heft of this. So what I've done here is I've graphed the annual earnings in constant dollars in 4 weekly hours bins 15 years after the JD for males and females leaving University of Michigan Law School. So they're all leaving the same law school from 1982 to 1991. And earnings here are clearly non-linear with regard to weekly hours. And this finding stands up to controls for years off, for years part-time, and it also is the same for men and women separately. Okay. In addition, not surprisingly, the people who work the fewest hours, women with children work the fewest hours. It's also the case that those who work the fewest hours are women in general, okay? Women with children, conditional on being a woman with a child. It's also the case that those who work the most hours are the ones who work more with Fortune 500 firms. So they work with people. They were also asked, do you work with rich clients? I thought that was an interesting question. Sure, why not? The final thing I want to show you with regard to the JDs is that with the JDs, you can actually ask them what their hourly wage is. Any one of you who's ever worked with a lawyer knows you can ask them what their wage is for 15 minutes, okay? And so they know how to multiply by 4, okay? So the hourly wage for those who report it, you can see, also rises with weekly hours. So that's pretty strong evidence. So that in sum, earnings with respect to hours are strongly nonlinear among the JDs. So let me turn to my final occupation very quickly, which is one of my favorite occupations. And as you can see here, it's a very high earning occupation for men. It's about the 8th or the 9th highest on an annual basis. For women, it's about the 4th highest, and that is pharmacy. Okay. Pharmacy is a high-income occupation with a very small gender gap. Pharmacy has undergone enormous changes. You can see here in the blue line, historically, that's the fraction working in independent pharmacies, going from about 70% to about 14%. That's an enormous change over the last 40, 50 years. You can also see the fraction female is the red line. That increases quite a lot. It's sort of around 65% now. So that's also mapped on the left axis, and mapped on the right axis is the gender gap. And you can see that that gap, as ownership shifts from individuals to the corporate sector, it's very interesting. The corporate sector is good for women here. As that happens, there's a much smaller gender gap. Part-time work in pharmacy is extensive, particularly for women. This is the fraction part-time by age, and you can see that not only is part-time high for women who have little kids, but it continues to be high, which is, I think, an issue that troubles me a bit. But there is almost no penalty to part-time work. So the first column uses a special survey called the Pharmacist Workforce Survey, and you can see and this is using data on hourly wages, and there's no part-time penalty. The part-time dummy is just about 0. If you don't like this special survey, you can use the CPS Morgue, where we have information on hourly wages, and you can see that there is a part-time dummy for all college graduates, but for pharmacists, if you add those two together, the part-time penalty is about 0. Okay, so let me conclude and say that I think we now know what must be in the last chapter for it to be the last, and it's got to contain considerable economic change and not be a Band-Aid. I'm always a bit angered by articles that are written by CEOs and others that say, my firm is doing everything it can to have family-friendly policies. I'm not saying family-friendly policies are bad, but they're not telling me how much it costs, okay? So if there's a family-friendly policy and women in 10 years don't get the promotions, and even at 2 years, their earnings per unit time is 50% what the guys are, then family-friendly is really nice, and we've created these tracts in which women are earning a lot less than men, which is where we get these big differences. So I don't want flexible work at bargain prices. The point is that temporal flexibility has to be less expensive. And as I said, there's been a restructuring of jobs organically in many occupations, particularly in healthcare. Many of the science and tech occupations have built-in flexibility because the projects are more independently done. The spread of information systems has led to change in other sectors. When you go to the pharmacist, you give pharmacist John your prescription, you come back and pharmacist Jane is there, and pharmacist Jane knows everything about you because in that computer isn't just what you bought at that Walgreens, but everything, because it's your health insurer's information, not that pharmacy's information, okay? And the medication is pretty standardized. Everything is going in the direction of very good substitutes, and yet they're very highly paid. So just being a good substitute doesn't mean that you're a commodity and you've gone the way of a low paid job. So the most important point that I want to make, though, is that the last chapter isn't just about women, and this isn't a woman's problem, and it's not a zero-sum game, and all the changes that I've described can better everyone's life. So thanks a lot.